So at this point, we've looked at the overview of urine production based on the mechanisms of action throughout the nephron. We've looked at the concept of filtration at the glomerulus with an independent filtration pressure getting created, independent of blood pressure, forcing fluid across the wall of the glomerulus, bringing with it fluid and solutes, creating a tubular filtrate that now is going to start to begin to make its way down the tubular portion of the nephron. Today we're going to look at the actions of the first two segments of that tubular portion, the actions at the proximal convoluted tubule and the loop of Henle. At each section, we're going to look at the transport mechanisms involved that cause reabsorption out of the tubular fluid and back into the circulatory system to be taken up by the vasa recta and the peritubular capillary. So before we even begin, it is critical that you understand your mechanisms of transport. Simple and facilitated diffusion, osmosis, primary and secondary active transport. And then once you get each of the individual types of transport down, it's going to be important to get a feel for how they all can work off of each other in the same environment. Because in any given part, we're going to be talking about multiple different types of transport occurring in the same place, all working together to achieve reabsorption from each particular section. So just to reiterate, the overall production of urine involves the filtration of the blood at the glomerulus, the removal of fluid and solutes, and putting it into the tubular portion. As we make our way through the tubule, proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule, and collecting duct, we are going to be reabsorbing anything that we still want to put back in the blood as a means of reestablishing normal blood composition. Any waste products or any otherwise usable solutes that we have in excess will simply continue on through the tubule, make its way to the end of the collecting duct, and wind up as urine. Further along in the tubule, we can see instances of tubular secretion, where we see things enter the tubular fluid that didn't make its way there by way of the actions at the glomerulus. In the proximal convoluted tubule, we'll be looking at the majority of solute reabsorption. Approximately 60 to 65% of all solutes that were just filtered at the glomerulus are immediately reabsorbed back into the blood through the wall of the proximal convoluted tubule. And some of the references you might even look up as you're studying this will imply that even the 60 to 65% can be a conservative minimum. Anything that doesn't get reabsorbed from the proximal convoluted tubule now makes its way into the loop of Henle. We will get substantial water reabsorption from the tubule, particularly the descending limb. We will also get active transport of salts out of the ascending limb. The distal convoluted tubule, more of a topic for next lecture, we're going to be combining physiologically with the collecting duct, because together both of those portions are going to be the sites in which we can use hormones to elicit a response. If we want to reabsorb more or less water, we can control that using hormonal control on those two particular parts of the nephron. So last time we talked about the actions at the glomerulus and the production of the filtrate. Today it's going to be the actions at the proximal convoluted tubule, reabsorbing 60 to 65% of our solutes that just got filtered, and the actions at the loop of Henle. And once we look at the loop of Henle, we're going to be distinctly dividing that loop of Henle up into a descending limb and an ascending limb. Recall one more time that anything that gets reabsorbed re-enters the circulatory system at either the peritubular capillary or the vasa recta. Both of those are capillaries that are simply an extension of the efferent arterioles that were leaving the glomerulus. So if you were a red blood cell that didn't get filtered at the glomerulus, you entered the glomerulus to the ascending, or the afferent arteriole. You went through the capillaries of the glomerulus without passing through the walls, continued on out the other end, and exited the glomerulus through the efferent arteriole. The next blood vessel you would find yourself in would be the capillaries of the peritubular capillary or the vasa recta. It will be the actions that we see at the proximal convoluted tubule more so than anything that will accentuate our concepts of our transport mediums, because that's where we see so much solute reabsorption. As far as blood composition goes, any solutes that are in the blood, their levels are going to be regulated to quite an extensive degree by the transport maximums of any of the protein transporters we'll be talking about at the proximal convoluted tubule. So again, 60, 65, and again, I'm even, this slide here even indicates up to 70. Regardless of what the actual number is, there's where we get most of our solute reabsorption. We will see this driven by primary active transport of the sodium-potassium pump. That's going to be where we look first. Then we will see a second process, secondary active transport, followed by passive diffusion back into the peritubular capillary and the vasa recta. So we're going to be breaking this down into 3 different transport steps to make it make as much sense as possible. We'll also be breaking it down into various fluid compartments. Basically, areas that these fluids have to pass through as they make their way from one part, being the tubular fluid, all the way through to becoming part of the fluid that's in the blood again at the peritubular capillary and vasa recta. And hopefully everything that I just said will start to make more sense once we start looking at the mechanisms. So we'll look at it on the diagram here first, and in just a moment we're going to start applying this to the whiteboard. But we're going to use this diagram to start to orient us first. Here is your tubular fluid. Remember, it's a cross-section of our peritubular capillary. Now, one of the places where people really start to go wrong immediately is that they assume the nephron is a cell. We talked about the neuron as a cell, talked about the muscle fiber as a cell. The nephron is not a cell. It is the subunit of the kidney that's made up of cells. So when we say that we're reabsorbing things from the tubular fluid of the nephron, we are having to bring it through the membrane of the cell wall that butts up against the tubular fluid. Those solutes are going to pass through the intracellular fluid of that cell. It's going to pass through the cell membrane opposite the tubular fluid, and then eventually enter the capillary wall of the peritubular capillary. Now, from here, you see this says peritubular capillary. Realize that could have also said vasa recta. To keep me from having to say both of those capillaries over and over and over again, I'm just going to use the term peritubular capillary. But understand, I could have used either. Either would have worked. So we're also going to be referring to these regions that I was just talking about. We're going to number them for ease of reference. We have 4 different compartments of fluid that will be looking at these solutes literally shifting through and being transported through. The first one we have is our tubular fluid. That's going to be the fluid that contains all the solutes that we just filtered from the blood. Of those solutes, we're immediately going to be reabsorbing up to 70% of them. The second compartment is the intracellular fluid of the cells that make up the nephron. So if we're going to absorb things through the nephron wall, we literally have to go through the cells that make up the nephron, in the front door and out the back door, so to speak. We have our interstitial fluid. This is extracellular fluid. It's outside the cells that make up the nephron. It's not in the blood. It's interstitial. Back when we talked about fluid shift, Starling-Landis fluid shift, and the lymphatic systems draining fluid that stayed in the interstitial spaces in excess, this would have been one of the regions that we would have been talking about, the interstitial spaces. And the last volume of fluid is going to be our final destination for these solutes, and that's going to be the blood. So we start with solutes in chamber 1. They cross the cell membrane and enter the cell to make up the nephron for chamber 2. They go out the back door of that cell, so to speak, and wind up in the interstitial fluid surrounding those cells. And then finally, they're taking up across the peritubular capillary wall and into the blood as our 4th and final destination here. Now, we've got examples of primary active transport, right here with our sodium-potassium pump. We'll see examples of secondary active transport all along the cell membrane wall that butts up against the tubular fluid. And we see instances of facilitated diffusion as those solutes move from the intracellular fluid, number 2, into the interstitial fluid, number 3, and finally into the blood, number 4. Facilitated diffusion the whole way through there. So now let's start to break down the step-by-step manner. I said we would start with a primary active transport. We would follow up that with secondary active transport. And then the last thing we would see is a whole lot of diffusion. The primary active transport that we see drive this excessive reabsorption is going to be our sodium-potassium pump. The same sodium-potassium pump that you are probably sick of hearing about by now. We talked about it in AMP1 with the neuron. We talked about it in AMP1 with the muscle cells. We talked about it as part of the SA node cells when we did cardio. Pumping out 3 sodium ions, pumping in 2 potassium ions. That is going to be the driving force for the bulk of this reabsorption. That's where we start, understanding that we see an active transporter along that cell membrane wall. Now, sodium in particular is going to be the solute that we put most emphasis on right now. And you'll hear me say this probably a couple times as we go through this. We have to follow the sodium. where do we see the high versus the low concentrations of sodium ions? So first of all, just based on the fact that we've got an active transporter here, pumping sodium out of that cell, would we expect the intracellular fluid, chamber 2, to be high or low in sodium? The answer to that question is low. We've got active transport pumping sodium out of that cell, creating a low concentration of sodium inside the cell, and therefore a high concentration of sodium in the interstitial spaces. So we've got a nice, strong concentration gradient now of sodium created, with low in chamber 2, high in chamber 3. So that starts to set the stage where all the sodium happens to be. Now we've got 2 more places to be of concern. Chamber 1, our tubular fluid, and chamber 4, our peritubular capillary. Would you expect our tubular fluid to be high or low in sodium? We would expect the tubular fluid to be high in sodium. Sodium is an extremely prominent solute in the body. So remember, sodium gets a bit of a bad rap because we do eat an awful lot of it. But if you've gotten this far now in anatomy and physiology and you haven't gained some appreciation for just how important sodium ions are to the function of just about every cell we've talked about, then you really overlooked an important aspect. So we expect sodium ions outside the cells to be of high concentration. Therefore, we would have expected a lot of sodium to get filtered at the glomerulus. Therefore, we would have expected a lot of sodium to make its way into the tubular fluid. So we anticipate this to be a high concentration of sodium. The flip side to that, and this is the part that I really want to make sure you ask questions about if you don't understand what I'm about to say. The reason that sodium ions are high in the tubular fluid is really the exact same reason why sodium ions are particularly of low concentration in the peritubular capillary. Remember, blood entered our afferent arteriole, carrying all that sodium. The sodium leaves the blood at that point and makes its way into the tubular fluid. Remember, we said high concentration of sodium in the tubular fluid. What didn't get filtered at the glomerulus exits the efferent arteriole and ultimately winds up forming our peritubular capillary that surrounds the nephron. So we expect high concentrations of sodium in the afferent. We expect low concentrations of sodium in the efferent because all that sodium wound up in our tubular fluid. Because the peritubular capillary, chamber 4, is simply an extension, a continuation of that efferent arteriole, then we expect sodium to be low in the peritubular capillary as well. So now, we said that we have our sodium-potassium pump being the driving force for that abundance of reabsorption from the proximal convoluted tubule. We said the next thing we had to appreciate is where the sodium is. We got a high concentration in 1, we've got a low concentration in 2, we got a high concentration in 3, and we've got a low concentration in 4. See how it alternates. High, low, high, low. Now we can use that to our advantage. We know that ions, molecules love to diffuse from a high concentration to a low. If you remember our discussions on secondary active transport, Really what we were witnessing there was diffusion of a solute that we had previously put in that location through the efforts of primary active transport. So the reason we have a strong concentration of sodium from 1 to 2 is because we pumped out the sodium from the cell. All along this wall, the membrane separating the tubular fluid from the intracellular fluid, we will see secondary active transporters. We will see secondary active transporters. Now remember, secondary active transporters always use 2 solutes. We will see symporters for sodium and fill in the blank. We will see symporters for sodium and glucose. We will see symporters for sodium and calcium. We will see symporters for sodium and magnesium. The sodium becomes the constant because that's the one we've predictably created this alternating high-low concentration gradients for. And as the sodium enters that cell, based on its concentration gradient, it will drag another solute with it. Each secondary active transporter transporting sodium and the partner. So now by using secondary active transporters there, we are actively transporting all these other solutes from the tubular fluid across that cell membrane and into the interstitial spaces. You will hear a phrase. I'm not going to say you're going to hear a term because it's not used as a term, but you will hear a phrase that reabsorption from the proximal convoluted tubule is a passive process. And I don't think we'll see a more misleading statement in any of the coursework we do this semester. When we use the word passive, we used it very particularly when it comes to transport. It involves the movement of a solute from a high concentration to a low. And that's not what we're talking about here. Really, what the references should say is they should avoid the word passive like the plague, and they should use terms like automatic. All of that 60 to 70% of solutes that get reabsorbed at the proximal convoluted tubule is an automatic process. We don't have control over it. It is certainly not a passive process. It is very much driven by active transport, which is how we're able to accomplish such a high degree of reabsorption and transport in such a small window of time. So we have our situations of high-low sodium concentration created because of the filtration at the glomerulus, putting all the sodium in our tubular fluid, removing it from the blood. Our sodium-potassium pump separates the sodium from the intracellular to the extracellular in the interstitial fluids. Then we use secondary active transport using the sodium concentration gradients to secondarily active transport all those other solutes from the tubular fluid and into the intracellular fluid of chamber 2. Any active transport, doesn't matter what kind it is always creating a concentration gradient. So we are pumping glucose from the tubular fluid into the cell. We are pumping calcium from the tubular fluid into the cell, creating high concentrations of those fluids inside chamber 2, our intracellular fluid. Now from there, our third type of transport really becomes the dominant step, facilitated diffusion. From here, because of the actions of those secondary active transporters, we will see for any solute we want to talk about moving forward, glucose, calcium, magnesium, potassium, high concentrations from 2 compared to 3, and high concentrations of 3 compared to 4. So therefore, we will see a continual step down of facilitated diffusion from the intracellular fluid into the interstitial space, and then again from a high concentration of 3 into a low concentration of 4, further facilitated diffusion, bringing those solutes into its final destination of back into the blood. Now, some of you who might already be a little bit familiar with the types of transport might be thinking, how long can this go on before we reach equilibrium? And of course we won't, because the solutes at the tubular fluid are always being replenished because of constant filtration from the glomerulus. Remember, we talked about that last time, of maintaining a nice constant filtration rate. Remember, anything that gets reabsorbed into the peritubular capillary doesn't linger there. It's taken up into the circulatory system. Blood flow takes those solutes away. So we'll always maintain that high-low concentration difference of sodium due to the ongoing filtration at the glomerulus, replenishing the tubular fluid, the ongoing movement of blood through the peritubular capillary, and the ongoing actions of our sodium-potassium pump. And by doing that, we actively transport all of those solutes from the tubular fluid that we just got done filtering and pumps it back into the blood. Anything that doesn't get reabsorbed there, either it's a true waste product and we don't have any secondary active transport mechanisms to reabsorb it, like urea. We won't see a secondary active transport for sodium and urea. But remember, we're also dealing with protein transporters that have a maximum rate of transport. So if any solutes were of particularly high concentration in our tubular fluid, we won't have enough time to reabsorb them all. We will reabsorb just enough to reestablish normal blood levels. Whatever didn't get filtered continues on past the proximal convoluted tubule and now finds itself in our loop of Henle. Now, the loop of Henle is an interesting part of the nephron. We see two different types of transport playing off of each other. We see the loop of Henle divided up very specifically, regionally, into these two types of transport. But we also see that particular shape, that hairpin turn shape of the loop of Henle, being a crucial structural advantage to getting maximum water reabsorption. From the loop of Henle, we will see the descending limb, the first part that we come to, the descending limb, be only permeable to water. Once we round the turn here and head descending limb, we see the ascending limb be only permeable to salt. Descending limb only permeable to water, osmosis. Ascending limb only permeable to salt. We see active transport of those salts from the tubular fluid and out into the interstitial spaces. Because of that, we see one limb amplify the rate of transport from the other and vice versa. Think about the scenario that we're going to have going on here. If we've got our tubular fluid going down the descending limb and all we can lose from that fluid is water, what's happening to the concentrations as we go from the beginning of the loop of Henle towards the end of the descending limb? because we can only lose water, as we descend the descending limb, the tubular fluid becomes more and more and more concentrated with solutes. What drives osmosis? What do we need outside our descending limb to encourage solvent movement across the membranes of the nephron? Well, we need a hypertonic solution. Remember, water will always move in the direction of the hypertonic solution. We get that hypertonic solution because of the active transport that's going to come from our ascending limb. The more salts that leave the ascending limb, the stronger the hypertonic environment around the descending limb, which drags even more water out of the descending limb, concentrating our solutes in the tubular fluid more and more and more, creating a better situation and a higher rate of transport out of the ascending limb. So if we, just for ease of nomenclature here, if we label the descending limb as A, and we label the ascending limb as B, we can rattle them off a little quicker. The more transport we see from A, the higher the transport we will then see from B. Additionally, the more transport we observe from B, that's going to result in even a greater rate of transport from A. So A drives B, B conversely drives A even harder, and we get this amping up effect. We call this amping up effect counter current multiplication. Counter current because the loop of Henle has two directions that run counter to each other. We got a southbound lane and we got a northbound lane. Any interstate that you'll be on has counter currents. Traffic moving in two directions. Multiplication implying that amping up of A driving B and B driving A. Now, I said earlier that the structure of this was critical. We need to have the ascending limb and the descending limb in close approximation to each other. If we were to take this loop of Henle and straighten it out, so that here's the apex of our turn, and we label that kind of here, with this being our descending limb, this here over here being our ascending limb, if this is the situation we had, any active transport from the ascending limb now would not be in the vicinity of the descending limb to create the same degree of hypertonic environment to encourage osmosis. We'd get less osmosis, therefore we would get less concentration of our tubular fluid as we made our way towards the ascending limb, which would limit the rate of transport from our ascending limb. We need a parallel structure here and close approximation of both limbs of the loop of Henle in order for us to get that multiplying effect. So we have osmosis from the descending limb, we have active transport from the ascending limb, and the transport of each is influencing the rate of the transport of the other. If we look at a different diagram and actually put some numbers on here, you can see that as we lose water from our descending limb, the concentration inside our loop of Henle increases as we approach the apex of that turn. This increasing concentration sets up a scenario where we get a highest possible rate of transport from our ascending limb, creating a greater hypertonic environment around our descending limb. The stronger we can get this hypertonic environment, the more water we'll see move across by osmosis, giving us an even greater degree of concentration of our tubular fluid. And round and round and round we go now. Again, of A driving B, and B conversely driving higher rates of transport from A. So to kind of summarize what we've done so far now, you'll see me do this a number of times as we're going through this material. We maintain a constant filtration rate at our glomerulus, creating a tubular fluid that begins its way down the tubular portion of our nephron. The first stop we make is our proximal convoluted tubule. There, through active transport, we reabsorb a sizable percentage of all the solutes that we just went through the trouble of filtering out of the blood. Identify that the sodium-potassium pump drives it. Identify the alternating concentration gradients of sodium that are created. Then, following up on the primary active transport of the sodium pump, we see secondary active transport move things out of the tubular filtrate and into the cell of the nephron. And from there, we see facilitated diffusion move those same solutes out of that cell, but in the opposite wall, into the interstitial fluid, and finally back into our peritubular capillary. Anything that didn't get reabsorbed there makes its way into the descending limb of the loop of Henle. Descending limb of the loop of Henle is only permeable to water via osmosis. In order for us to have osmosis there, we need to have a hypertonic environment. Therefore, we need to have active transport of solutes from our ascending limb. The more active transport we get from our ascending limb, the more osmosis we'll see from the descending limb. The more concentrated the fluid we get inside our tubule, the higher the rate of our transport from the ascending limb is going to wind up being. So if this particular section is really leaving you with your head spinning, you will have to go back and review your transport concepts. This is one of those topics where you simply can't power through unless you understand primary and secondary active transport, facilitated diffusion, osmosis, concentration gradients, equilibriums. We need to have that foundation of transport down so we can apply it to the actions of the nephron. When we meet again, we're going to be looking at the actions of the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. Now, this is going to be our last gasp to reabsorb things out of that tubule. And we're going to primarily be looking at the reabsorption of water and salt. It's at these two portions that we have a little bit more fine-tuned control. By this point, we've already reabsorbed almost everything we need back out of there. Through the actions of our proximal convoluted tubule and the loop of Henle, most times your work is done now. However, there are times when you want to reabsorb even more water if you're dehydrated. That's where we're going to see the hormonal actions of ADH, ANP, and aldosterone acting on the last portions of that tubular fluid. This is also the portion where we're going to see more tubule secretion. Things entering the tubule to be included with the urine. Hydrogen ions, carbonate, potassium. So As always, if you have any questions, please let me know, and we'll work our way through it until you understand. Take care, and I will see you next time.